So we are moving from still on price adjustment going to variation in estimated quantities. I started going down this road a little bit before I realized I was going down the wrong road on differing site conditions. So now I'm going down the right road. Similar to differing site circumstances, variations in estimated quantities involve a fixed price contract, the state providing an estimate of the quantity of some component of the work to be done, the vendor's price being based upon experiencing approximately this level quantity of the component, and if the quantities actually experienced exceed a stated variance from the listed estimate, the vendor or the state is entitled to an equitable adjustment in the contractor's fixed price. And I will emphasize, or the state. This is something that we can benefit if something is less than anticipated. So, differing site conditions is, again, typically construction or something physical in nature where you don't know what you're going to encounter. You're supposed to give a fixed price. If you encounter something markedly different that causes you to incur higher prices, you can get an appropriate adjustment termed equitable adjustment in the price. Variations in estimated quantities is the same basic concept. You are involved in doing some kind of contract activity where the vendor has to give a fixed price to do that activity. But in doing this, in the specifications, the state will, for at least one aspect of those specifications, provide an estimate of how much they think the vendor will have to provide of something to do the overall project or activity. And what this does is provide some limitation of how far things might be able to vary from that estimate before an equitable adjustment is appropriate. So let me, yes?
I assume when this happens, you have to go back to the board?
Board of Public Works?
Depends on the amount of...
Yeah, I mean, see, this is part, you have to go to the board if you have a contract modification which exceeds $50,000. But this is a clause in the contract. So this is not a modification to the contract. So the only reason you would have to go back to the board, if it is a board item at all, is if the original approval level that you receive from the board is going to be exceeded by more than $50,000. Because this is not a modification to the contract. It's just changing how much the vendor's entitled to be paid.
Right, but then that would ultimately change, I mean, if it's over 50,000, it would change.
If the board approved a contract for $250,000 and due to this circumstance you need a $60,000 increase, number one, it's not a contract modification unless you had an absolute not to exceed price in the contract, that the not to exceed price would have to be adjusted because of this. And then that part would be adjusted and you're going to the board because they approved 250 and now it's going to be 310 or something like that. But implementing, just like implementing an adjustment for consumer price index, that's not a contract modification. It just, is it within the contract amount that you've already had approved? If it is, you just keep going. And if you need to have a change in your contract approval level, then whether it's within your agency, whether it's a DBM, whether it's a DGS, whether it's a Board of Public Works, whatever approval you need for the new revised contract amount. Okay, as described in examples that follow, the variations in estimated quantities clause requires the vendor to honor its fixed price if the quantities actually encountered in performing the contract are within a stated variation from the estimated quantity. And the usual one, the default one that is in COMAR, is the 25% above and below the estimate. And what that means, if you take the estimate being, let's say, 1,000 cubic yards of dirt, as long as what the vendor does as far as if they have to remove dirt, as long as the actual amount they remove is within 75% of 1,000 cubic yards or 1,250 cubic yards, their fixed price is still a fixed price because the actual amount they removed is within, if the variation is 25% above or below the estimate, that means 75% to 125% of the estimate. So the regulation says as long as it's within that range, fixed price stays. They still have to do it for the fixed price. But if what they actually do is outside the range, if it's more than 75% below, or it's more than 25% less than the estimate, the equitable adjustment means the state pays less. If they actually only had to remove, if I said 1,000 cubic yards and they only had to remove 500, that is 50% of the estimate. So the state gets an equitable adjustment between the 75% range and the 50% range, and they might get several $1,000s that they have to pay less. Conversely, if the vendor has to do 2,000 cubic yards, that is 100% of the estimate, which obviously is 75% more than 125%, so the vendor gets an equitable adjustment, so they get more money under their fixed price contract. So the requirement there is, anytime you have a fixed price with an estimated quantity, a required clause is the variation in estimated quantities clause. So it's a mandatory clause. What is not mandatory is the variation. Whereas if you look in Title 21, the typical example is 75 to 125. You can use whatever estimate you want. You can make it a 10% variation. So that it's going to be, if it's more than less than 90% or more than 110, there's an adjustment. Or you can make it 20 rather than 25%. So you can change the quantity. You have to use the clause, but you can change the quantity of the variation. And the possible equitable adjustment can apply in the vendor's favor if the quantity needed exceeds the upper range, and apply in the state's favor if the usage is less than the lower range. I had already said that. Situation. And actually, I will say that as I thought about this some more, this isn't even a valid situation, but I'll use it anyway and see if anyone can identify why this is not a valid situation. And I will also tell you, I wasn't smart enough to know this, because this is a situation that happened that came to me while I was here, and I didn't know that I shouldn't even be using this, and I guess I lucked into the correct answer, but not because I knew what I should be doing, because I didn't know any better to know that I shouldn't even be thinking about it at all. So anyway, here's the situation. The facility pharmacy contract was bid as an indefinite quantity contract with several years of information on the actual number of prescriptions dispensed. So we say that in a typical year, we will dispense 20,000 prescriptions to the residents of this particular facility, or 10,000, or whatever the number was. And we would give like 3 years worth of historical information on the number of prescriptions dispensed. The price sheet used the average number of prescriptions per month from the historical data as the usage number for a model of assumed quantity. What that means is the vendor was supposed to give a dispensing fee, and then we said if our average was 10,000 a month, their dispensing fee times 10,000 extended comes to a price. So that was there. And there was disclaimer that the model was for bid purposes only and not a guarantee of a minimum or maximum quantity of prescriptions to be ordered. So all standard stuff. The invitation for bid had a variations in estimated quantity clause, which, as I will explain to you, it shouldn't have, because this was not a fixed price contract. And a variation in estimated quantities only applies to fixed price contracts. But anyway, not knowing that, I thought I was smart in putting this clause in, not knowing I was doubly not smart, not even knowing it doesn't apply. In this particular instance, we followed the routine where we allowed the 20% variation. So the estimated and variations in estimated quantity clause said that if the actual usage was less than 75% of the estimate we had on the price form, or more than 125%, the vendor would be entitled to an equitable adjustment. And what happened was that when the contract was awarded, I guess about 2 years or so into the contract, the vendor who was providing the pharmacy services came back and filed a claim because they said, well, we're getting a whole lot fewer prescriptions than the estimate contained on the bid form, and we had given our price, our dispensing fee, based upon having that volume, and since we're getting a lot less volume than that, we need a higher dispensing fee. We need to be paid more than like $3 per prescription or whatever it was at that time. Contractor said it was losing money at the actual usage levels and wanted to get a higher dispensing fee than it had bid. Would you pay a higher fee? We have one no. Anybody else want to venture? We have another head shake no. How many would pay a higher fee because the vendor was getting less than they anticipated? How many would say no? How many would say, all I want to do is get out of here on a Friday afternoon, so, so I don't care what the answer is. We are taking the names of those that raised their hand on that one. Gary is taking notes. Answer for now, indefinite quantity contracts must have the best available estimate of projected usage, real ones that have fixed prices. The variations in estimated quantities clause is designed to provide relief if actual usage is outside the 25% plus or minus range from this estimate. The contractor is liable for the first 25% of variation, but the contractor is not liable for more than 25%. And also another thing, the vendor is not liable for even 25% if the estimate was not a valid estimate, and I will explain that in a moment. And what that means is if the estimated quantity had no real basis. In this instance, the agency verified the historical number of prescriptions listed in the IFB was accurate. Yes, we gave you the number that actually we dispensed. We gave you the actual 3-year average. There was no known circumstance at the time of the bid that would cause the historical estimate to not be a good predictor of future need. There was no reduction in the patient census. They didn't change from an acute care facility to a chronic care facility or anything of that nature. So the request was denied.
Yay.
Don't know. It was Deer's Head. Why did it go down? I don't know.
Less patients, so less people.
But now what I didn't realize at the time, and I can remember pondering, was the vendor entitled to more money? And I went to and looked up the decision, a number of the decisions of the Board of Contract Appeals. And even though I read these decisions, it didn't dawn on me that because I did not have a fixed price contract, I shouldn't even been entertaining the request at all, because the vendor got their price for each prescription that was dispensed. The fixed unit price, and if they had 10,000 or 20,000, whatever it is, they got that fixed unit price. They didn't get, let's say, $100,000 to do all pharmacy services, period, which is what a fixed price contract means. So the vendor didn't know that, but I guess I should have and didn't. And I still came up through that logic and said, no, you can't have an adjustment because we didn't make any mistakes in our estimate. And the first answer I should have said is, it's not a fixed price contract. This, number one, the variations in estimated quantities clause shouldn't even have been in there because we didn't have a fixed price contract. So now you know how unsmart I was then and how smart you all will now be in the future about this situation. Answer in the future. Continue to ensure that agencies conscientiously research historical data, disclose any known circumstance, situation that would cause the historical data to not be reflective of anticipated future use. Continue to provide the best available information. See also slide whatever for another example using variation. Now, what I will explain is when I was doing the research of the decisions of the Board of Contract Appeals, one decision in particular kind of stuck in my mind. And it was one for highway construction where it was a fixed price contract, a real one, and the vendor, in the specifications, it was listed that it was estimated that the vendor would have to remove X cubic yards of dirt for places where they wanted to level out the elevation, where they had hills, and the road was supposed to be relatively level. You have to take dirt away, and there was an estimate of how many cubic yards of dirt would have to go into depressions where they had to fill it in to again make the road relatively level. And in this particular instance, the vendor had to both excavate a whole lot more and then the estimate in the specifications, and also fill in a whole lot more dirt than what was in the specifications. So the vendor went for an equitable adjustment, and the State Highway Administration turned down the request because even though it was a lot more, it was within the 125% of the estimate. So it was like maybe 23, 24% more, which was a lot when you're going into that amount of dirt to take away and put in, things of that nature. And the vendor filed an appeal with the Board of Contract Appeals, and through the hearings that entailed with trying to determine the correct answer by the Board of Contract Appeals, it turns out that at some point, I guess the attorney for the appellant with the state procurement officer on the stand asked them where they came up with the estimate that they had used to put in the specifications. And the answer was that they had done another construction project involving a highway, and they used the same quantities as they used for that other project. And it turns out that the project that they used was in no way comparable to the one that they were doing at this point in time. So in so many words, what the decision of the Board of Contract Appeals was even though the variations in estimated quantity clause will apply when the state actually does due diligence to try to come up with the estimate, in a situation where they figuratively just pulled a number out of the air and had done no research to try to determine whether it was or wasn't appropriate, and just relying upon the crutch of, oh, well, we're protected within 25% above or below, the Board of Contract Appeals ruled that in this particular instance, since the state had not done a valid estimate, the vendor was entitled to an adjustment for everything from the estimate.
I would have thought the vendor would have had to actually make the estimate.
No, the state makes the estimate.
Okay.
I mean, that's where this comes in the state. The state puts some number of expectation in there and says to the vendor community, now give me a price based upon these specifications, including how much we think you're going to have to put in or take out of whatever it is. And you have the variations to protect both parties if the variation is extreme. But based upon this decision by the Board of Contract Appeals, what was determined that only applies if the state has actually done conscientious determination of what they really think the estimate's going to be. And other than that, in so many words, what is said is the vendor is not responsible to eat the first 25% of the state's incompetence. That was certainly not the way the decision read, but that's what it turned out, that Highway had to compensate them for the full amount of variation. So that's what variations in estimated quantity means. Let me see what else. And that's what I mean by the best available information. Okay, let's see. I thought I had an example after this, but obviously I don't. So this, most of you are probably not going to be involved in fixed price contracts where you are giving estimates of this nature. Again, this typically happens in construction. I don't even know if I know another instance beyond construction, although I do have an example of where it was claimed this came into play, and that will be later when we get to modifications. But if you're doing construction, so DGS and transportation, this happens all the time with them. But other than that, I don't know if it's going to be applicable to the rest of you, but now you know you do have a situation that exists if you put in these requirements with a fixed price contract. You were knocking to get attention? Okay. We have 50 more minutes. You can't stay awake for 50 more minutes? Accounts payable. Well, actually, we're probably going to get to the into these slides before 50 minutes. What are the procedures? So now we're changing, again, we're back to contract management, and in particular, paying the vendor when the vendor is entitled to payment. We had a lot earlier today about determining when it's entitled to payment. Now we're going to more mundane type of things, not necessarily the issue of are they entitled to, but just how do you do it. So we're talking about accounts payable. What are the procedures? So this is something that should be done internally within the agency as part of the contract management plan for the agency. And there should be a determination, number one, who's going to get the invoices? To what degree is that person going to validate the invoices? If it goes to accounts payable, well, I guess not if, but when it goes to accounts payable, what sign-off is necessary? Just what are the procedures related to accounts payable? What are the timelines for getting, who is to determine the invoices are accurate? What are the timelines for getting the invoices paid within the timeline stated in state law? And we're going to get that, I think, in a slide or so. State contract costing principles for cost reimbursement contracts. If it's a cost reimbursement contract, you pay allowable and allocable costs. Easy for you to say, right? Which I don't know if I've come across a true cost reimbursement contract yet in the state. It's something we frequently talk about, cost reimbursement, but most things we call cost reimbursement isn't. So I don't know the degree to which I talk about that in this class, but anyway, this is something that has to be validated. And you have the certification of payments to subcontractors, which has been in existence now for about 2 years, otherwise known as the prompt payment clause, that vendors are required to promptly pay their subcontractors when they've gotten payments from the state, unless they have valid complaints with the subcontractors. And if they have valid complaints, then they can only withhold the amount of the complaint that is valid. Otherwise, they have to pay promptly. And if they don't have a valid complaint against their subcontractors within X days of the state paying the prime has to pay the subs, etc. And what, I don't know, 30 days, something like that. I went backwards. Okay, no one wants to go backwards, right? Untimely payment of invoices, going more into the issue of payment. The policy of the state is to pay invoices within 30 days. If you go to 21070118, and if you go to State Finance and Procurement 15103, you will see that it says it is the policy of the state to pay invoices within 30 days. Another thing, if you go to State Finance and Procurement 15104A, you will find, and you can imagine this in this day and age, that I guess I should point up here, a contractor may charge a state agency 9% interest, pretty good deal in this day and age, on any invoice that remains unpaid 45 or more days from the date of receipt by the agency back to the 31st day of the receipt. Now let me explain this because things are going to seem confusing. You're going to say, or you're going to read that we have a clause that says the state pays its invoices within 30 days. So does that mean the state has to pay its invoices within 30 days? No, it does not. And in fact, there is no recourse to a vendor if the state pays the invoice within 45 days. But if the state goes more than 45 days without paying a valid invoice, and that's another caveat, it has to be a valid invoice, then the vendor can now not only get payment for the amount of the invoice, but can seek payment of interest at 9% on the amount of the valid invoice that has been unpaid from the 31st day on. So if we pay in 44 days, the vendor gets nothing other than the amount of the invoice. If the vendor submits an invoice, but we determine that there's a problem with the invoice, it's not valid, we don't have to pay within any time frame because we're not supposed to pay a non-valid invoice. And we had a lot of discussion on the second day about some of the circumstances of payment. But if, in fact, there is no contesting the amount and it's paid more than 45 days after the invoice is received, then the vendor can charge interest from the 31st day on at the rate of 9%. They have to charge that separately from the activity for which they're invoicing. They have to identify it as being interest, and the state will pay that separately, but allegedly the state will pay that. And obviously if we're getting 1% or 0.5% on most savings and things, 9% is pretty good. But the reality is, this 9% was put into law at a time when the interest rates were around, well, at least 13%, and in fact, I had seen some in the 20% range. And so at that time, 9% was a whole lot less than the prevailing interest rate at the time that went into law. And because it hasn't changed, 9% has become now gone the opposite extreme, from being far less than the typical interest rate to now being far more than the typical interest rate. And I can imagine there's many vendors that are saying, please don't pay me. Please go at least 45 days and let me make a 9% return on my money. But then the state has the provision that the controller's office wants agencies to process invoices within 25 days and get it down to the controller's office so the controller's office can pay it within 45 days and no interest is accrued.
I was going to definition of receipt.
Receipt? Receipt is probably however it's described in the specifications or however it's agreed in the work initiation conference. And I've never seen a definition for receipt for an invoice.
When I get it is when an AP gets it?
One of the things we say is we should inform the vendors about how they should submit invoices. In particular, who they should submit them to. If they are instructed to submit them to accounts payable, the receipt in accounts payable is when the invoice is received. If they're instructed to submit it to the state contract manager, when the state contract manager gets it is when it is received. And I know one of the complaints that frequently came from accounts payable when I was here was when a contract manager would get an invoice because the contract manager wanted to validate it, make sure that they were authorizing it to pay it, and they would hold on to it for like 10 days or something like that, or 2 weeks, and then send it down to accounts payable, and accounts payable would scream, well, if we're going to pay within our 25-day time frame, we only have like 10 days left. Why did you hold this for 14 days before you gave it to us? Because anything over 25 days, the controller's office would give them a great deal of grief if something came down to them after 25 days, because then it got to the point of maybe it would get to not being paid within 45, and maybe there would be incur of interest, and we don't want the state to have to pay interest because we're not paying in a timely fashion. So these are considerations for payment of invoices. Apparent contradiction. This is the one I just said. State policy is to pay invoices within 30 days, but a contractor cannot charge interest unless the payment occurs more than 45 days after the invoice is received by the agency. Then the interest may be charged from the 31st day until the date of payment, i.e. payment within 45 days does not trigger interest charges at all. Another complication. Charge for interest must be submitted within 30 days of the date of payment of the invoice. Obviously, if you're a vendor, you don't know how long to submit the invoice for interest until you've gotten the payment. If you don't get paid until 60 days, now you know that your period of payment of charging for interest is from the 31st day to the 60th day. So you have to wait till you get payment, and then you have 30 days to submit your invoice for the interest. And if you submit your invoice for the interest more than 30 days after you've gotten the payment, you can't submit an invoice for the payment for the interest at all. You won't get paid because it's outside the time frame. And you cannot get paid interest for a period longer from 1 year from the date an invoice was submitted, even if the invoice was paid more than a year after it was received. So it's a 1-year statute of limitations. Now, I can't imagine a valid situation where the state has held an invoice more than a year, but at least there is a finite limitation to how long a period the vendor can charge. So that would be from the 31st, if this occasion occurred from the 31st day to the 365th day, they could submit at an interest rate of 9% if it went more than a year without payment. Interest may not be charged on an invoice for the amount of interest. So if you bill me for interest, I don't have to pay you within 30 days or within 45 days, and if I don't pay you the amount of interest, then you get to earn interest on the non-payment of the interest. You got that? No. Well, then you have to say it again if you don't get it the first time. So that's the first point. If the reason for the non-payment is due to the agency disputing some aspect of the interest, that is not a non-contested valid invoice. If the reason we're paying you isn't negligence, it's because we don't agree that you should be paid. And so, of course, that's the typical answer. No, you can't charge interest because we're disputing whether we should pay you, so no time frame applies to that. And hopefully we've told you that we're disputing this, and we're not doing it over negligible amounts, as I said on the second day. If only part of the invoice is in dispute, the agency is to pay the non-disputed portion of the invoice within 45 days. So if you know there's only a limited portion in dispute, pay the rest of it within 45, or that can trigger the interest on the non-disputed portion. If the whole whole invoice is in dispute, then the time frame doesn't trigger at all. Let's see. So any questions on interest and payment of invoices and things of that nature? Many of you probably might have gotten a little conversation with accounts payable about they're really conscientious about that 25-day window. And they really, and lots of times, I can remember they wanted invoices to go directly to them because they were concerned that if it didn't go directly to accounts payable and it went to the program first for this validation and the program person sat on it for a while or was out on vacation or something like that, when it got to them, they wouldn't have enough time to process it within 25 days, and then they would get written up by the controller's office and they would have to explain why they didn't make payment within 25 days, and they got very upset when they were being raked over the coals by the controller's office for something that they will say it's the program's fault because they didn't give it to me. So that's why one of the issues you have to work out is who is going to get the invoices. And if the invoices go, and the dilemma I always had was, well, on the one hand, yes, I can appreciate accounts payable because they have this strict 25-day time frame from the controller's office being very, very conscientious about getting the invoices and processing them to the controller's office for payment. But I also was very concerned about, well, how do they know whether the invoice should be paid at all? If I'm the contract manager, I'm the one that knows whether it's appropriate, so I don't want it going to accounts payable and have them pay it, and then me come in later and say, well, the vendor wasn't entitled to this, and then do we try and get the money back? Do we hold it from the next invoice? Another complication. So that's where you try and work out these issues. And one of the things we did was to say that the original would go to accounts payable with a copy to the contract manager, and via working out the payment mechanism in advance and working out with accounts payable, have more or less a time frame. Okay, you have accounts manager, contract manager, maybe you have 10 days to come back to us with if there's any reason we shouldn't pay this, and if you don't come to us within 10 days or whatever time frame, we're going to pay it. So that's an illustration of what I mean by work out the accounts payable situation within the agency in advance so you know what it's going to be, so you try to avoid paying interest, you try to avoid your accounts payable being on the wrong side of the opinion of the controller's office, and you get valid invoices paid and not valid invoices not paid, etc. And in your specifications, or at the very least in your work initiation conference, tell the vendor who they have to bill to, whether they have to bill copies, things of this nature. And other things. Do they have to put on, such as we mentioned the second day, do they have to do it in blue ink or red ink? Do they have to have a particular, purchase order number or their contract federal tax ID number on the invoice? All that stuff should be stated so that you don't run into a situation of the vendor not getting paid when they really are entitled to payment. All right, any questions, comments? No comments from Gary. No comments from Mark. It's like, move on, let's get out of here. MBE compliance. I think I'm only going to say one slide on this because we're going to have a several-day class on this. But I will take questions. Worked out internally and then communicated via the specifications to the vendor. Who's going to receive the monthly MBE reports? Within the agency, who's going to get it? Is it going to be a Beverly Spence? Is it going to be the procurement officer? Is it going to be the contract manager? Who is going to get the monthly reports? Because what you don't want to have happen is the vendors, the prime and the subcontractor sending in MBE reports, and they're going to somebody who isn't there or cares nothing about this, doesn't look at it, and so no one is looking at whether the vendors are doing work, and so you have a compliance issue with no enforcement of the goal, and you have all kind of complications, particularly when you go for a contract renewal. And one of the requirements of a contract renewal, particularly going to the Board of Public Works, is we have to provide backup material of the fulfillment of the MBE goal. And if you had a 25% goal and you've gone 3 years and you're submitting the first renewal option and the achievement has been 3%, you're going to have some issues from the Board of Public Works, but in particular before that, you're going to have issues from the Office of Minority Affairs, who looks at this for everything that does go on the board and is going to want to know why you have 3% achievement for a 25% goal. And even before GOMA gets involved, they have asked us to do preliminary legwork, so we're going to look at it. You're going to have headaches. So work it out. Who gets the reports? It should be someone that's going to get it, going to know what to do with it, going to look at it, et cetera, et cetera. Who determines that the reports are complete? That's kind of like a corollary to who gets it. Presumably, it would go to the person who's going to look at it and ascertain whether it is as it should be. Because it doesn't make sense for one person to get it who doesn't know anything about it or what to do with it. And if it's going to be given to somebody else, why not just identify the other person that's going to be given to anyway? What are the procedures for having incomplete and unsubmitted MBE report problems resolved? If you as the agency are not getting reports monthly from the prime contractor and from the one or more MBE subcontractors, and there was an MBE goal, which if there wasn't a goal, you wouldn't be getting this anyway. Someone has to look at it, and number one, they have to know if they're not getting the reports, so that they're supposed to go back to the vendor and say, you are supposed to submit monthly reports, you're not doing it, give me the monthly reports and give it to me back to this date, either beginning of the contract or whenever they stop doing it. Someone has to tell them so that you get it, and then when you get it, someone has to look at it to see, is it reporting what it should be reporting? If they start sending in the reports and they say no participation, and that's going on for 2 or 3 months, should there be participation? Should there be participation every month? Or, since they've given you the MBE plan up front, do you know all the MBE participation is going to come at one point in time, let's say at the end of the first year of the contract? That's when something's going to be done that the MBE sub's going to be doing, so you are not alarmed if you're seeing several months with no participation. If you have a plan that says it's going to come at one particular point in time. Conversely, if the expectation is you're going to have relatively constant usage of MBEs, and you get the reports, and the reports indicate no usage, someone needs to contact immediately the prime contractor and find out why they're not using the subs. Is it a changing circumstance? Has the vendor, the subcontractor gone out of business? Whatever. Someone has to ascertain why there's not participation and do something about it. Yes?
What if there is an MBE goal submit a request to the department for another MBE, or what's the procedure?
Prime contractor, when they get the award, have identified on the participation statement and then the participation schedule what specific MBEs they are going to use and the specific activities for which they're going to use them and the specific percentage of the contract value that they intend to use them. Those become part of the contract. Not only the commitment to the goal, but the commitment to the goal and the commitment to use specific subcontractors for specific activities for a specific percentage are all contract content. And for a prime contractor to change the MBE subcontractor, any MBE subcontractor, can only happen via contract modification. To answer your question, yes, they must submit a request to whomever they are told is the contact person for MBE purposes. They must say, I want to stop using MBE so-and-so, and they must state why. And in most instances, the answer will be from the state, no, you cannot do that. Because even if a vendor, prime contractor says, well, they're not performing, or something like that, the state will not casually allow a vendor to change MBE subcontractors. That goes back to kind of smacking of why the law was changed in 2004 to require the identification of MBE subs at the time of submission so that a prime contractor does not have the flexibility, if you put it in a positive slant, or the nefarious opportunity, if you put it in a negative slant, to basically play one MBE off another. All right, I'm using you, and I have you for 6 months, and you're charging me $1,000 a month, but the whole while I'm shopping around it, you'll do it for me for $900? Okay, I'm not going to use you, I'll use you for $900. And then the whole while I'm paying $900 to you, I'm looking around, you'll do it for $800? Okay, you're out, you're in for $800. We are not supposed to allow that to happen.
What if I resign or if I leave?
If you tell the prime contractor, I don't want to do this anymore, so that it is not the contractor that is making a decision, it is the prime, then you're saying you don't want to do it, you're not available. If you've got a business, if you're purchased by a non-minority firm, so that you can no longer be counted. Those are reasons when the prime contractor comes to the state and says why they want to make a change. That's where you'll say, okay. But the most typical reason is we don't think the subcontractor is performing adequately. And so we want to use another subcontractor. And one of the first things that's going to happen is, well, what is your evidence that the subcontractor is not performing? Have you told the subcontractor they're not performing? Have they been given an opportunity to try to increase their performance if there is reasonable documentation they are not performing? And the history has been that in many instances where there have been allegations of non-performance by MBE subcontractors, and GOMA's the one that has particularly done a lot of this of checking, when they check with the MBE subcontractor and say, the prime contractor you're working for wants to stop using you because they've alleged problems with performance, they say, what are you talking about? They've never said a word to me about anything with performance. As far as we're concerned, we were doing everything fine. First time ever hearing it. We don't agree that we have not been performing, et cetera, et cetera. So there are times when the person in the state that is getting these reports and has to do compliance will have to kind of mediate between the prime and the sub in terms of, is there allowed substitution, is there not allowed substitution? But the vendor cannot do it without your approval. And the typical reason for the approval is unforeseen circumstances. And unforeseen usually means gone out of business, vendor themselves saying, I don't want to do this anymore, or there have been instances where a MBE sub has been bought by a non-minority firm, and as soon as that happens, then they will be decertified by MDOT, can't count them anymore, and the vendor prime, if they want to achieve the goal, they have to go to somebody else. But they can't do it on their own. They have to come to you, request permission, give justification, get your approval, and it has to be approved by the agency head or designee. So,
Performance issue, or the state's contract monitor could assure that the validity of the performance issues. I mean, we're watching the contractor as well, we're watching his entire team. If we notice one of his subcontractors aren't performing, we can validate his claim that they're not performing. The thing is, you just can't arbitrarily substitute these subs once they've been locked in on the proposal, but there are reasons you can replace them. You may identify a discipline that you thought was going to be used and isn't going to be used. That's a legitimate reason to add someone else on.
and there's a difference between adding another MBE versus replacing an MBE.
Right.
And I want to emphasize that.
It just can't be arbitrary, that's all.
When you're doing this in advance, both you and in particular the vendor, you're doing the old crystal ball type routine. In some instances, you're making predictions about what you think is going to be used or not used under the contract. And you say you're going to use an MBE for a certain activity. If things happen and it turns out that you don't need to do that activity anymore, well, you're not deliberately choosing not to use the MBE, you just don't have the activity for which that MBE was going to do work. So that's when what you would typically do is come in via a modification to add one or more other MBEs.
Proactively assure that the goal is met.
So you don't have to eliminate one, you can just add other ones still with the intent of meeting the original goal. There's a lot of considerations for MBE. And most people don't understand that the vendor cannot simply do these things on their own and tell you about it later. Like for instance, if there is real-time monitoring, which there should be, if you start getting reports that indicate that a subcontractor that was not identified originally is being used, immediately there should be contact with the prime contractor to say, what are you doing? Number one, why are you not using the MBE that you identified? Number two, why have you gone to this one? And you start getting the circumstances. And even if you know there is non-performance, if you're the contract manager and you know there's problems with the contractor's performance, and the contractor keeps alleging, well, it's that subcontractor that you, the state, made me use because I had to come up with participation. It is not unusual to find that they are bad-mouthing the MBE sub, but have never said a word to the MBE sub about supposed lack of performance. They just keep blaming them. And so that's where, at times, you might become involved in the fray and once the subcontractor finds out the allegations, then sometimes things are worked out. You can't just do it arbitrarily on their own.
And do you need monthly MBE reports if the goal is being met?
Do we what again?
Do you need monthly MBE reports?
You always need monthly MBE. It doesn't make any difference if the report is no participation. The requirement is both the MBE, prime contractor and any and all MBE subcontractors identified at the time of award must submit monthly reports of participation, of usage, payments, etc. And it can be 0, 0, 0, 0, and they're still required to provide it. And then someone is supposed to look to see whether 0, 0, 0 is appropriate. And that depends upon what was the prediction of usage. There can be times when the original MBE participation was going to come entirely on the front end. And
Meant if the goal was being met, if the goal is like 15% of MBE.
well, again, it depends. If it was front-ended and the vendor has met it at the very beginning, then maybe they can be given dispensation not to continue with reports. That's a maybe, because I actually don't know whether they still have to submit or not. But other than that situation, they have to submit reports. And even if it's 0, they're supposed to be advised, if they're not doing it, to go ahead and do it. Now, hopefully they're doing this electronically, so it's not, hopefully, a lot of effort, but they're still supposed to submit reports. And they can be meeting the goal, they can be surpassing the goal. But you still want to get the reports to make sure that part of the submission, and the reason to have both the prime and the sub submit, is you're getting this dual validation. It's one thing for the prime to say, I'm using subcontractors to the tune of $100,000 a month. You want the subcontractors to indicate they're getting $100,000 a month. And if the subcontractors indicate they're getting $5,000 a month, you got a disconnect. And you need to go back and find out what the situation is. Why is the prime reporting a whole lot more than the subs are? That's why you're getting it from both independently. They both are supposed to submit it to the state. The sub doesn't submit it to the prime for the prime to submit to the state. They both send it in directly.
Is there any foul if the sub, the minority sub is performing satisfactorily, but they may not be performing a task that they were initially identified as performing? I'm just trying to stall out, Joel. We got about 10 more minutes here.
Oh, I know.
I want to get into this next subject. We got about 10 more slides on the next subject. So
You're nothing but a staller. What is the next one?
you got about 10 slides on suspension of work. You don't have time to get into that. I'm working with you.
I would have if you wouldn't stalled.
I'm working with you, bro. Yeah. If we can stick to the script, we have plenty of time.
Well, the other thing is we would prefer to start with a new batch of slides on the third day, rather than 10 slides in one group and then switch to another one. What was your question?
It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what my question is.
That's for the other class. The kind of meetings tell me what to do and who enters. The last one is also important. Documentation. You need to know who was going to enter the information in AdPix so it's there. So when you're required to submit your agency, the annual report, you have information. And in fact, now you're supposed to be doing not only quarterly reports, but I think monthly reports.
And a
Monthly?
lot of times, GOMA will go to AdPix to get their information to assure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and compliance is being made. That's what GOMA will look for.
GOMA will seek to validate your information from AdPix, and their stance is if it isn't an AdPix, it isn't. You can say, well, we have this participation far more than what's in AdPix, and their answer is going to be, then put it in AdPix because that's the only thing we count. So let me get through suspension of work. Suspension of work is written direction from the procurement officer via a stop work order, whereby the contract is ordered to stop, suspend performing under the contract. The suspension can be either for a specified duration or until further notice is provided of what to do. Suspension of work may be ordered to, and this is one that Mark came up with because I've only done suspension of work a couple times and it was never to help a contractor, believe me. For the next class. To help a contractor when through no fault of its own, it may not be able to meet a deliverable time frame, i.e. whether delays in construction. Suspension may also be ordered in any circumstance when continuing performance might not be beneficial to the state, but the contractor's motivation is to continue performing to keep making money, i.e. if we are trying to decide if we need this activity anymore, or we're trying to decide if we should terminate the contract for convenience, for default, something like that, we don't want the vendor to keep working, keep incurring expenses that they're going to keep billing if we're trying to decide whether we want it anymore at all. So we have the right to give a stop work order that says, so many words, don't incur any more expense until we come back to you and tell you either to start again or we're pulling the plug entirely. Yes?
So the contract monitor issues a formal letter to the vendor saying, just suspend work until blah, blah, or?
A formal letter is issued to the vendor, but procurement officer. Procurement officer would do a stop work order, not the contract manager. I keep saying there's certain things only the procurement officer can do, and a suspension of work, i.e. stop work order, is one of them. So you will do an official formal notification to the vendor that says what they're supposed to stop, and either they're supposed to stop for a given duration or stop until further notice. And a suspension of work is not the same as a termination of work. Suspension simply means stop working and stop incurring expenses till something else happens. A termination is when it's going to end. At a given date, it's all going to be over. Suspension may be a prelude to a termination to stop the vendor from incurring expenses while you make the decision, but they're not the same thing in and of themselves. So I'll give this one quick example, and then you are on your way. And this is something you will love because this is so rich. All right, for a number of years, the Department of Human Resources had a contract with Adoptions Together to help arrange adoptions for children in foster care, which is a good thing. Good thing to get kids adopted. There were 3 stages involved in trying to get an adoption. A match, that's where you match a child with a family. Placement, where on a trial basis, a child actually starts living with the family. And then finalization, which is the legal adoption. And the way DHR bid this contract, there was a fixed amount paid for each stage. The vendor would get so much for a match, so much for a placement, so much for a finalization. And the presumption was that there would be a fair amount of attrition from stage to stage. There would be a lot more matches than there were placements, and a lot more placements than there would be finalization, so that vendors had to go out and do a whole lot of effort to do the front end to try to get a successful finalization at the back end. Was this? No, this was competitive. Because there's more than one vendor that does this. Due to attrition, and he works for me. Due to attrition, it would take many matches to result in fewer placements, placements to result in fewer final adoptions. Also, much time elapsed from the initial education outreach to the first stage and between stages. In other words, the vendor had to go into churches and organizations and do a whole lot of education to try to get people to agree to do adoptions. So they had to do a whole lot of upfront effort to try to get to the stages that would actually pay them money. Because of the substantial attrition rate from stage to stage, Adoptions Together undertook a very aggressive marketing of the prospect of adopting a child, blanketing churches and other social organizations that historically were the best sources of adoptive parents. Because of its successful marketing efforts, Adoptions Together reached the not-to-exceed contract amount of its contract well before the contract was due to expire, and primarily through matches and placements, with few actually getting to a finalization as of that point in time. Now, despite the contract having a not-to-exceed amount, now, does anyone know what not-to-exceed means? Not to exceed? Is that what it means? Oh, well, who would have ever thought? Despite reaching the not-to-exceed amount, Adoptions Together continued its marketing efforts and continued to build human resources for each successive stage, match placement, and then adoption finalization. Since DHR liked the end result, they're getting adoptions, they kept paying their invoices. And they never changed the not-to-exceed amount. The invoices just kept coming in, and they approved them, and they paid them. No problem with that, right? These are just words on paper. They don't really mean anything. When the end date of the contract arrived, now you're getting this. So you have a not-to-exceed amount. Then you have when the contract is supposed to end. It actually says it ends on like March 31st or something like that. So the end date of the contract arrives. And Adoptions Together continues its marketing efforts and kept billing DHR for each successive stage. DHR accounts payable stopped AT. Now, the contract is over. No matter how you look at it, the contract is over, but bills keep coming in. And they kept being approved up to a point in time when accounts payable, not the contract manager, but accounts payable finally realized, wait a minute, we're just a tad over the not-to-exceed amount. But reportedly, DHR program personnel informally encouraged Adoptions Together to keep up the good work and said invoices would be paid. Well, yeah, accounts payable isn't paying them anymore, but just keep it up. Doing a good job, we'll take care of it. 18 months after the end date of the contract, and close to $200,000 after the contract was supposed to be over, DHR, at the advice of their Assistant Attorney General, sent a stop work order to Adoptions Together. Now, this was a first, because normally you don't have to send a stop work order to a vendor to stop working after the contract's over. This is certainly not the typical stop work situation. But we don't care the minor things like stop work orders. Despite receiving a stop work order, Adoptions Together continued its marketing efforts and continued to build DHR for each successive stage. It took an additional 3 months, so it was already 18 months after the contract was over, and 3 months after the stop work order was issued before Adoptions Together, and additional direction from DHR to Adoptions Together to cease and desist work before they stopped trying to actively get more matches, placements, etc. By this time, it had billed DHR $240,636 for which it had not been paid because it was over the not to exceed amount of the contract. DHR came to DBM and said, will you approve these for payment? And that's when we said, well, tell us what's going on here, and started delving into the particulars and found out all this issue. And the first answer was no. So after a lot of fact-finding and discussion with DHR, DBM agreed to process a retroactive contract modification for about $195,000. This was based upon the fact the work was done. There was no dispute the work was done. There was no dispute the work was desirable. And the fact that no one was disputing the fact that they had kind of been told to keep up by DHR despite the fact the not to exceed amount was exceeded and the contract was over. So on the one hand, you penalize the vendor because the agency keeps telling them to keep going. But the one thing we did refuse to do was authorize any payment for any work that was done after the stop work order. In other words, we drew the line in the sand that said, it's one thing to pay you up to the point you got a stop work order, but a stop work order means stop work. And so we're not going to pay you for anything beyond that. So we said we would not even submit something to the Board of Public Works for the additional $45,000. Adoptions Together objected to not receiving the whole $245,000, or $240, whatever it was. They hired a lobbyist, which I always marvel at nonprofit organizations hiring lobbyists, to get the full amount. And actually, the lobbyist called me and wanting to know why I was holding up the payment of the money. And I told the lobbyist why I was holding up payment of the money. And so we refused to approve the entire amount based upon the clear direction to the stop work order, i.e. what part of stop work don't you understand? They're two simple words, stop work. Even if it's work stop, still the meaning comes through. It was emphasized that the state could repudiate the entire 24636 because, and this goes back to the first day, the original contract was never modified. It still had a not to exceed amount that was exceeded. It had a contract end date where work continued after the contract was over. So even if it was good and desirable, we could walk away from paying them the entire $240,636. And no one because it was never modified and no one at DHR was expressly authorized. You remember the first day we talked about express authority to allow Adoptions Together to continue to work past the not to exceed amount without a properly approved modification. So based upon discussion with me, we're saying if you agree to the 195, we'll submit it to the board. They said okay. They signed the modification, went to the board, and it was submitted as a voidable modification since it's coming in like almost 2 years after the fact. Controller Schaefer, at the board meeting, and I remember this, who is going to be fired? I want names. I want to know who authorized this. I want to know who's going to be fired. And the DHR secretary was there, and he said, the person isn't here anymore. Don't give me that. Someone's still there that was involved in this. Someone needs to be fired. I want to know who they are. And for about 5 minutes, it's the person who was responsible is no longer here. I can't believe every single person who was involved in this is no longer there. I want to know who's going to be fired. So for 5 minutes, it's going back and forth with that level of activity and the incense from the controller about the fact that this situation had occurred. And he only relented to some degree after about 5 minutes of continually being told, they're no longer here, they're no longer here. And I think the governor and the treasurer started to kind of try to get the controller to, all right, let's just try to approve this thing and get this behind us and quit going down that road. But it took about 5 minutes to get there. But even then, he kept saying, and without specifically saying so, the controller was alluding to section 7234 of the state finance and procurement article, barring any state employee from spending monies in excess of appropriations. And if you go to 7234 of state finance and procurement article, you will find out that a state employee who does authorize the expenditure of state funds and excess of authorization is subject to termination, and the state is not liable for the actions of the employees. The state could repudiate whatever the employee supposedly said the vendor could do, because there is nothing in the state aside from actual authority. There is no implied, there is no express authority. If it doesn't come from someone who has the authority to do it, it is not authorized, period. Is that, the board reluctantly approved the item and may not have done so if the full amount had been included, including the $45,000 in work after the stop work order. The board's refusal to approve the mod as avoidable action would have meant the board would have found the action to be void. So you have void and you have voidable, which we talk a little bit more about these things later. And upon a void finding, there would have been the problem of trying to determine if Adoptions Together was entitled to any payment for expenses for work they had done. Was that the end of it? So even though, first determine the issue whether it was void and then possibly nothing after the date. Likely it was only the good purpose of the contract that saved Adoptions Together from the void finding. One more, if I can actually. This is not a typical example of a stop work order since it was issued after the contract was over, but it illustrates the consequences of continuing work after a stop work order, how agency personnel involved with the contract often are relied upon by contractors, possibly to the detriment of the contractor. This also shows that accounts payable, not the contract manager at DHR, was the entity that first realized that payment shouldn't be made, but all this should never have gotten to this point. There was no contract management. So you got 3 minutes early. What more can you ask for?